All right, chat. I'm back. We're good to go. All right. Let's go. From the potlatch to the residential schools. The human race is divided into Monster Zero Ultra. I'm going to be wired. The human race is divided into several broad families, distinguished as a rule by the color of their skins. Asia is the home of the yellow man, Africa of the black man, Europe of the white man, and America of the red man. Today, Canada is inhabited mainly by the white or European race. W. Stuart Wallace, opening paragraph in A First Book of Canadian History, authorized by the Minister of Education for the Public Schools of Ontario, 1943. Found a hat for me. Oh, that's funny. Stupid Bitdefender. This is not my laptop, it's my parents'. In 2014, the Canadian government officially opened the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, built at a site where the Red and Assiniboine rivers meet, an historic gathering place for Indigenous people, and now a cultural tourist center in Winnipeg. Architecturally unique, the museum figures prominently into the Winnipeg skyline and is featured in plenty of postcards, sometimes framed by fireworks from Canada Day celebrations, which take place just outside the museum. It seems to stand as a reminder to Canadians that this is a nation that cares about human rights, justice, and equality. Visitors to the museum may be shocked by the stories of terrible things that have happened elsewhere in the world, but can leave at peace, knowing that they live in a place where people care and wish to make the world a better place. Even the very premise of the museum, dedicated to improving the lives of people around the world, reinforces the ubiquitous, self-satisfied notion that it is very Canadian to want to help people. If only it were so simple. In fact, the Museum of Human Rights is a deeply contradictory endeavor, manifestly developed by competing interests that could not cohere logically. There was a mention of police violence against working-class movements, and yet the museum prominently thanked its extremely wealthy sponsors, including Great-West Life, RBC, and the Asper family, the very class whose interests those police were defending. It devoted a small section to the plights of contemporary migrant workers, many of whom face extremely exploitative conditions in Canadian agribusinesses, but highlighted quotes from individual workers expressing their gratitude for Canada giving them opportunity and ensuring their rights are protected. The Visitor's Guide roughly acknowledges that the museum's water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, but makes no mention of the fact that, as a result of the diversion of water to Winnipeg, the reserve itself has not had clean running water for decades. As Adele Perry argues, the case of Shoal Lake perfectly illustrates that the Canada we know is entirely dependent on the genocide of Indigenous peoples. Winnipeg has water because Shoal Lake 40 does not. This, ultimately, is why the Museum of Human Rights failed to achieve what its most idealistic designers and curators would have wanted. To do so would profoundly undermine the interests of its backers, the Canadian government and the capitalist class. While valiant attempts are made to tackle complex problems, racism, state violence, genocide, they cannot provide a coherent explanation of these problems without adequately addressing their root causes. After all, the sponsors of the museum do not want to be named as its villains. The museum struggles most with how to present Canada's relations with Indigenous peoples, named by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2016 as cultural genocide. Much space in the museum is devoted to showing respect for Indigenous traditions and culture, but relatively little has been done to highlight the conscious and concrete ways that Canada worked to destroy that culture. Museum goers might easily be left with the impression that, while Canada made mistakes in the past, it is now working hard to address and resolve those problems. Hint, hint, it's not. But genocide does not happen because of a few mistakes. It is the product of a conscious and concerted set of policies designed to eliminate, to erase, a group of people. The quote at the top of this chapter, drawn from an official Canadian history textbook in the 1940s and presented as a simple matter of fact, illustrates that Canadians well understand the process. A place that had once been home to the red man was now inhabited by the white race. Its original inhabitants had been erased. In this chapter, I illustrate that Canadian foreign policy towards Indigenous peoples over the past century and a half has largely been consistent with the patterns established during the period of Confederation and the passing of the Indian Act. Far from righting the wrongs of the past, Canada has redoubled them. Whatever its new museum might say, Canada unswervingly prioritized the interests of Canadian capital over its international obligations to Indigenous peoples. The colonial imagination that shaped its early encounters remains ever present across this period. Also, NTC, I've been failing everyone today and not saying welcome to the show. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the reading. The War of 1885. As the previous chapter documented, I want everyone to feel seen. It's important. Because that's the first step into being heard. As a previous chapter documented, the period from 1860s to the 1880s marked the beginning of Canada and the beginning of the end of Indigenous life as people knew it, especially in the West, where many Indigenous survivors of colonialism had sought refuge. This was the period of catastrophe that turned once strong and healthy nations into fragmented, isolated bands, barely surviving on destitute reserves. These open-air prisons, guarded by agents of the Department of Indian Affairs, DIA, were often characterized by hunger, disease, and demoralization. They were the ghettos which housed a people defeated, and their conquerors were arrogant and abusive. The starvation crisis that had exploded with the collapse of the buffalo herds was, by the early 1880s, threatening the very existence of the indigenous peoples, whose numbers were falling drastically. Treaty promises of seeds and implements to support reserve agriculture were woefully inadequate, failing both due to government inattention and as a consequence of its fundamental colonial purpose. Canadian policy had sought to disperse Indigenous peoples widely to disrupt their traditional connection to the land and to one another. As a result, a reserve at Assimilation was located over 100 miles away from the nearest mill, such that even when they successfully threshed grain, converting it into useful food was a monumental task. Canada's miserly policy of providing limited, sometimes rotten food aid, often in exchange for forced labor, also played a key role in the crisis. On rare occasions, individual Canadian settlers would support Indigenous claims that food was rotten or tampered, as when Dr. F.X. Girard reported that bad flour had contributed to the deaths of 20 people on a Kainai reserve. Girard was denounced by his superiors for promoting inefficiencies. Bad flour had contributed to the deaths of 20 people on the Kainai Reserve. Girard was denounced by his superiors for promoting inefficiencies, as in it's more efficient to give them rotten flour. Capitalism rotted this country from the inside out from day one. Violence almost erupted after more than 100 Cree and Chief Peapot's band died from eating rancid pork delivered by the Canadian government. They had traveled over 350 miles from their home in the Cypress Hills to the reserve near Regina on the explicit premise that they would receive rations, and had pointedly complained about the rotten meat. Indian Affairs Commissioner Edgar Dewdney had replied, "The Indians should eat the bacon or die." This turned out to be a false binary. They did both. Only a few months before, the local settler newspaper, the Regina Leader, had reassured the white settlers of Regina that the government is bound to feed the Indians, so as they are fed, the poor creatures are no more likely to give trouble than a kennel of dogs fed at regular intervals. This quote not only highlights the dehumanizing way settlers were encouraged to view the Indians, but also reinforces the fact that they were well aware of the starvation crisis facing Indigenous people. Control over these limited rations was given to local DIA agents, who often used this structural power to cast themselves as mini dictators. So-called Indian agents carried out a wide range of abuses, and although most Indigenous people were too weakened by hunger and disease to mount significant resistance, their anger simmered and occasionally boiled over into violence. Incidents and conflicts increased in the early 1880s, and in 1884, the first major uprising took place at the Sakame Reserve. When Indian agents refused to hand over food to starving people, Chief Sakame and a group of armed men broke into the storehouse and seized the food themselves. Though no one was killed in the standoff, tension was clearly brewing. The growing tension finally spilled over in 1885 in a series of minor conflicts between Cree and settlers, most notably the killing of 9 Europeans at Frog Lake and the larger Metis Resistance that has come to be inaccurately termed the Riel Rebellion. At Frog Lake, 2 DIA agents had run the reserve like their own personal fiefdom and developed a reputation for their nastiness. John Delaney was roundly hated for his relationship with very young women of the reserve and his casual humiliations of the hungry people. Thomas Quinn, himself of mixed ancestry, would withhold rations to extract teenage brides, and once summoned everyone to the ration house for food, only to declare it an April Fool's joke to the unimpressed starving Cree. Though the settler press would call it the Frog Lake Massacre and use it to whip up support for repression, the Cree warriors had legitimate grievances against Quinn, Delaney, and the other DIA agents they killed. As historian J.R. Miller notes, 3 of the 12 Europeans at Frog Lake were spared and treated humanely, even despite their indirect complicity in the crimes of the others. As similar uprisings took place at other Cree reserves, the common denominator was that the killings of settlers were not random. Revenge was taken against those who had been cruel or withheld food, like farm instructor James Payne and rancher Barney Tremont, while those who had cultivated more or less respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples were spared and even assisted by groups of warriors during the uprisings. Nevertheless, Canadian authorities hunted the rebellious Cree, killed dozens of them, and established what were effectively show trials at Battleford that resulted in the largest number of simultaneous public hangings in Canadian history. The bodies were left in the noose for 15 minutes for psychological effect. After 1885, Canada effectively embarked on a counterinsurgency warfare. Indigenous peoples were divided into loyal and disloyal factions. The pass system was enforced. Local political structures were further dismantled, and reserves were subdivided to disrupt collective farming, and by extension, political practices. Indeed, the blending of Canada's ideological and material goals in this period was perfectly articulated in 1890 by the DIA Commissioner, who proudly reported that the work of subdividing reserves has begun in earnest. The policy of destroying the tribal or communist system is assailed in every possible way, and every effort made to implant a system of individual responsibility instead. (1890) Destroying the tribal or communist system. That should tell you the attitude of some people to the left in this country. Metis Resistance. Concurred to, but not in conjunction with, the Cree rebellions, was the major Metis resistance around Batoche. Although Canadian authorities treated the events of 1885 as though they were a connected uprising across the Northwest, in reality, many of the Indigenous nations were too weak or intimidated, or their leaders were paid off too well to join. In reality, many of the Indigenous nations were too weak or intimidated, or their leaders were paid off too well to join in the resistance. Still, the mid-1880s presented the prospect of a major challenge for the fledgling Canadian national project. Although the Canadian Pacific Railroad had reached the prairies, construction was faltering due to the lack of funds, and European settlement had slowed as the effects of the 1873 global recession began to set in. In the area of Batoche, where most Métis had relocated after the Red River Resistance, even many of the white settlers were unhappy with the governance of the Northwest. To European settlers, the Métis troubled the simplistic colonial ideologies they had otherwise accepted. Were these civilized Europeans or savage Indians? It was clear that the Canadian government viewed them as the latter, most likely because they largely rejected the Canadian national project, viewed themselves as autonomous and independent, and employed self-governance structures that bore greater resemblance to their indigenous heritage than to anything the whites had established. In 1884, when discontent began to build around settler towns like Prince Albert, the Canadian authorities noted with much alarm that, as in 1869, many of the European settlers were finding common cause with the Métis. From the ranks of disgruntled settlers emerged leaders like William Henry Jackson, who had worked with English mixed-race leaders like Charles Adams and Métis leaders like Gabriel Dumont in building a broader people's movement in the Central Prairies. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was extremely concerned about the prospect of a union of white and Indigenous resistance. He immediately set to work besetting division, taking control of the newspaper in Prince Albert and using it to spread propaganda, highlighting and exaggerating the violence of the Cree and Métis uprisings. Howard Adams explains that Macdonald resolved to make certain concessions to the white residents of the Northwest, while at the same time allowing the Métis and Indian situation to aggravate itself to the point of desperation and hostility. This tactic allowed Canada to send a major military force into the region on the premise that it was dealing with a violent Indigenous insurgency, while also subtly reinforcing Ottawa's dominion over the Northwest. Settler capitalism, after all, requires a working class. While early waves of European settlement were imbued with the grandeur of colonial superiority, the reality of this economic system was that, before long, the majority of the settlers themselves became an exploited class. Their subservience to the system that exploited them was often won through the promotion of the colonial imagination. As Gerald Horne argues in the Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism in 2017, white settlers, often escaping hardship in capitalist Europe, reveled in the knowledge that they were true masters of their new land. Seduced by the idea of their supremacy, they became the foot soldiers of settler capitalism, battling with indigenous people over the land they believed they deserved and which represented the key to their ascension out of the ranks of the impoverished and the exploited. These promises were typically illusory. John A. Macdonald and I.G. Baker didn't want to share their wealth with glorified peasants, even if they had English names. The horizon of settler capitalism was a highly stratified society where the majority worked hard and earned little in order to sustain the enormous profits of the few. But in the establishment of that system, it needed a settler vanguard, convinced that they would be the winners and that the only thing preventing them from realizing their dreams was the presence of indigenous people. Thus, in periods of indigenous resistance, the elite needed to keep the settlers on their side or face outright catastrophe. The prospect of interracial solidarity and upheaval was an old colonial problem in the Americas. In the 1720s, indigenous and African slaves led a revolt at Natchez. In the 1730s, a similar plan was uncovered in New Orleans. In the 1740s, a plot to poison slaveholders in South Carolina involved several white settlers. In 1741, colonial authorities blanched at the prospect of a wicked and dangerous conspiracy of white people and diverse Negro slaves to burn down Manhattan. The prospect of marginalized groups, including poor white workers or indentured servants, joining forces struck terror in the heart of the American elite, which enacted a range of policies and laws to prevent such alliances from forming, while simultaneously embarking on a psychocultural project to deepen the white supremacist logic at the heart of the white working class. This problem similarly animated the decisions of the Canadian government in 1884 and 85, as it worked to manage the resistance in the Northwest and keep the settlers on side. Thus, the government reached out to angry whites who were forming organizations like the Northwest Farmers Union and tried to build bridges with them, while turning them against the Métis and Indigenous resistors. Despite the efforts of settlers like William Henry Jackson to maintain solidarity, whites were increasingly willing to accept the claim from Ottawa. A tornado warning? Oh my God. That's not good. Keep an eye out to the news, please, for the love of God and all things that are holy. Despite the efforts of settlers like William Henry Jackson to maintain solidarity, whites were increasingly willing to accept the claim from Ottawa that Cree and Métis were engaging in a kind of race war, bent on killing settlers and seizing their land. Welcome to the show, Mycelium Opsis. Welcome to the show. We're doing a little bit of reading of Canada and the world, and Marshwart got a tornado warning, so we're all hoping that that doesn't actually amount to anything, because that would be bad. Macdonald organized a massive police and military force to occupy the Northwest, ostensibly to protect the settlers from Indigenous violence. After much provocation from within the Métis community, where the government had employed the spy Charles Nolan to stir up violence, and the amassing of Canadian armed forces in the region, the conflict began with a police attack against the Métis at Duck Lake. Though outnumbered at a ratio of nearly 7-1, the Métis fighters had greater skill and awareness of the terrain and won an easy victory. Poised to inflict heavy losses, Louis Riel convinced Gabriel Dumont to show mercy, and thus only 10 of the white police were killed. Nevertheless, the police set fire to Fort Carleton that night, claiming that the Métis had done it as part of their savage attack against settler authorities. This piece of theater was effective, and thousands of whites in Ontario enlisted to join the force to crush the savage and lawless mob of Métis who were threatening the West. Pardon. Sorry. That was gross. I'm sorry for that. The new army was brought to Saskatchewan on the unfinished Canadian Pacific Railway, and ultimately the small Métis guerrilla force would be faced with nearly 8,000 Dominion soldiers and would be besieged and overrun at their home in Batoche. The assault on Batoche was merciless. Bullets were sprayed into civilian homes, killing people as old as 93 years. As reported by observers to the Toronto Mail, and even in the House of Commons, Canadian soldiers ransacked and set fire to Métis homes, literally looting and pillaging the village of their enemy. What they could not steal, like ovens and beds and tables, they smashed. Métis leaders were executed or imprisoned, and John A. Macdonald wrote to Edgar Dewdney to explain that the executions of the Indians ought to convince the red man that the white man governs. Louis Riel, an important but by no means indispensable leader, was put on trial to prominently illustrate both Canada's victory and its magnanimity in offering its enemies their day in court. Indeed, Riel's ongoing use and misuse in Canadian politics and mythology generates some ambivalence from contemporary Métis. What is less discussed in the public sphere is that the Metis resistance has been compelled. Oh, Comrade Internet, welcome to the show. I'm sorry you didn't get the notification, but I'm glad you're here. What is less discussed in the public sphere is that the Métis resistance has been compelled by the fact that they were starving, their very survival imperiled by the Canadian government's refusal to provide them with land titles and seeds and farming implements. A backlog builds. Rather than provide the relief that would have kept the Métis alive, the government had, in fact, replied by accusing them of squatting on valuable land. John A. Macdonald went as far as to demand payment from the starving Métis for the land they were trying to farm. Even the settler newspapers of the Northwest and the Northwest Mounted Police had acknowledged in 1884 that the Métis, decimated by the collapse of the buffalo hunt, would not survive without imminent support. The full colonial depravity of Canada's refusal to support the Métis farmers is manifest in the fact that, after the slaughter and destruction of Batoche, Macdonald offered land grants twice the size of those the Métis had asked for to the very soldiers who had just ransacked Batoche. Despite all this, contemporary military historians still justify the assault, claiming it was a response to open rebellion against the legitimate authority of Canada. And chat, I'm going to... So yeah, oops. If you want to catch up on the past readings, that's the playlist. Let's keep going. Assimilation, extermination, cultural genocide. The rebellious year of 1885 ended with the mass executions of starving indigenous people at Battleford and the burning of the starving Metis settlement at Potlatch. Or, as military historian David Burkeson triumphantly put it, the West had been saved for Canada. White settlement was now a reality from coast to coast, and the indigenous peoples would no longer be allowed to disrupt that process in any way. The reserves were effectively converted into prisons, and the fact that they were typically on poor agricultural land meant that the ill-equipped prisoners would continue to starve. Canada's Indian Affairs Commissioner Hayter Reid called Indigenous people the scum of the prairies, and Canada actively recruited European settlers to populate the territories adjacent to the reserves in order to ensure white domination of the prairies. Fewer and fewer Indigenous peoples were given passes to leave the reserves to hunt, and they were further discouraged from doing so when the state began seizing guns, horses, and ammunition to prevent future rebellion. Measures were taken to more effectively seal off the border with the U.S. to prevent Sioux resistance from spreading northward, though this concern was significantly reduced after the horrific massacre of the Sioux by U.S. forces at Wounded Knee in 1890. The crisis of hunger and tuberculosis continued in the ensuing decades, with death rates as high as 127 per 1,000 in the Qu'Appelle Valley. This whole book is showing just how, like, from the start, capitalism and colonialism rotted our country from the beginning. Within a few decades, Canada would create a department of health that specifically excluded Indigenous people. Their health care, tellingly, fell under the portfolio of mines and resources. Having crushed Indigenous military action, the Canadian government sought to crush Indigenous spirits. Resistance requires hope, and so measures were taken to stamp out any sources of Indigenous hope. As such, Canada embarked on a more rigorous effort to undermine whatever was left of Indigenous culture by making Indigenous cultural institutions illegal and by breaking Indigenous children from their local and family traditions. Though many spiritual celebrations had already been deeply disrupted by the reserves and the pass system itself, all Indigenous religious ceremonies would soon be banned by the Dominion, as Canada increasingly possessed the capacity to target the very fabric of Indigenous culture. Notably, among these restrictions was the outlawing of the Potlatch ceremony after 1884. Practiced by many nations of the Pacific Coast, most notably the Kwakwaka'wakw, I hope I'm saying that right. The potlatch was a gift-giving ceremony that was at the heart of the political economy of many Indigenous peoples of the West Coast. These were societies that were affluent and complex when European traders began arriving in the 18th century. Their material abundance reflected in the amount of time that people of higher castes would devote to art and expression. Many contemporary Canadians still marvel, for instance, at their magnificent totem poles. The Pacific Coast peoples did not experience significant dislocation in the early years of European trade, but pressure emerged in the late 1850s when the prospect of gold brought Europeans in droves to the Fraser River Valley. Until that point, British governors of the colony had been fairer in their dealings than elsewhere in Canada, generally preventing settlers from seizing land that Indigenous people wanted. This changed in 1860s as British settlement and conflict over land grew. Without any formal treaty process, settlers began forcibly relocating Indigenous people away from the places they wanted, as when the Songhe were dispossessed of the area around Victoria. Settlement and displacement exploded after the arrival of the Intercontinental Railroad. Yeah, Canadian culture is like its very existence is dependent on the destruction of another. The potlatch ceremony, though it appeared spiritual on the surface, was also profoundly economic, serving as a mechanism for wealth distribution and providing for collective economic security. If one band was ill prepared for a coming winter, they could get what they needed at the potlatch. If another was well stocked, they could earn social and political capital by giving generously. Occasionally, surplus would actually be destroyed at a potlatch in order to illustrate strength and prestige. Europeans expressed incredulity at such practices, which they saw as bankrupting themselves and squandering opportunities to accumulate wealth. The earth is Marxist, definitely, and the earth has our back for sure. Well, I'm glad the tornado's not going to come anywhere near you. That's good. As J.R. Miller notes, the ethos of the potlatch was the antithesis of the individualism and competitive accumulation that underlay Euro-Canadian society. And so it is no surprise that Canadian officials were appalled by the ceremony and worked to undermine it. Missionary William Duncan called it the most formidable of all the obstacles in the way of the Indians becoming Christian or even civilized. For his part, Prime Minister MacDonald motivated the band to Parliament by expressing concern that the Indians feel yet that they are the lords of the country in British Columbia. The banning of the ceremony gave authorities one more tool to use against Indigenous people, though it initially didn't stop the potlatching. Ceremonies continued in defiance of the law, sometimes taking place in secret. But in the 1910s, and especially the 1920s, as the settler population of the West Coast grew to engulf the Indigenous peoples, arrests and repression of the potlatch increased. Notable among these efforts was an episode that struck with all chords of colonialism. In 1922, a number of people convicted of potlatching at Alert Bay and Cape Mudge were offered a deal wherein their prison sentences would be commuted if they handed over all of their ceremonial regalia to the government. The elaborate masks, whistles, rattles, and other potlatch artifacts were sent to museums in Ontario. That's wild. Well, at least someone's making money off it, right? Like, that's the most important thing. In addition to banning the potlatch, the Canadian government amended the Indian Act to cover other Indigenous ceremonies, outlawing any Indian festival, dance, or other ceremony of which the giving away or paying or giving back money, goods, or articles of any sort forms a part or is a feature. Any form of wealth redistribution by Indigenous peoples was now forbidden. This legislation was also used to undermine the sun and thirst dances of the plains though, like the potlatch, enforcement was inconsistent. In extreme cases, Indigenous elders were sentenced to jail time for hosting a dance and giving a dinner. More typically, dances were permitted but only in curtailed and limited fashion. In 1914, Indigenous people were legally mandated to get government authorization simply for wearing Indian costume. By the turn of the century, the threat of Indigenous resistance was no longer taken seriously. The War of 1885 had been a final stand, and the repression that followed, combined with the rapid influx of European settlers, had made Indigenous revolution a less pressing fear. Many settlers, in fact, began taking an anthropological interest in the people they now viewed as an ancient dying race. Even as the political and economic hearts of ceremonies like the Potlatch and Sundance were being carved out, their superficial flavor was being preserved by settlers in museums and exhibitions, most notably the Calgary Stampede. And while Indigenous people performed buffalo hunts for white audiences, the Canadian government was creating a national park to preserve the buffalo herds that had collapsed, but not for Indigenous hunters. Wood Buffalo Park forbade Indigenous hunting, even while it considered a proposal to sell individual hunting licenses to wealthy sport hunters.